The advertiser said, "Cinema, marvel of the century." Truly, it appeared as a marvel of the century when, in a wet July evening, a group of Mumbai aristocrats attended the first film show ever to be held in Indian subcontinent. It was July 7. A group of people came to Bombay's Watson Hotel. The hotel is no more there, but the earlier Lumiere films were all shown. Tickets were rather costly, priced at ₹1. So, only the rich could afford to have a seat. When the train arrived at the Gare du Nord, when the workers came out of the factory, the audience applauded and it was a huge success. The newspaper reported the incident next day and cinema became popular with the Indian masses. Very soon, cinema went out of the coveted auditoriums and became acceptable to the people. There was a Charavanawala caste meant for the poor, and almost at the same time cinema reached Kolkata also. Around 1897-98, a Dhaka boy, Hiralal Sen by name, gate-crashed Pate's tent in Maidan and learned how to project. This was a historic moment for cinema because Hiralal Sen very soon began to travel with his cinema thing all over Bengal. And we have records that in 1904, even in a remote corner of the then Bengal at Bhola SDO's bungalow, cinema was shown. What was those cinemas? Imported cinemas were there, train arriving at Gare du Nord or workers coming out of factory, but the Indians were fond of Indian scenarios. So, Harishchandra Bhatbhadekar in Bombay and Hiralal Sen in Kolkata began to make films. It is most unfortunate that we do not offer the credit due to Hiralal Sen. He was the first man to make a feature film that way. In fact, in 1903, when Khyot Prasad Vidyabinod's Ali Baba was staged, he filmed the theatre. That way, it can be said that he was the maker of first feature film. He took several films of several theatres. They were all fragments, say Bankim Chandra's Bhramor or someone's Ali Baba, etc. Hiralal is credited with the documentary films also. He is the person who photographed the entire anti-partition movement led by Surendranath Banerjee in 1905, and he is also the man to make first advertisement films in the subcontinents. He filmed C.K. Sen's Jaba Kusum Oil, he filmed as campaign for Edwards anti-malarial specific, etc. But the history did not take proper attention of that. Now is high time when even Amitabh Bachchan is admitting that it was Hiralal Sen who initiated film in this part of the world. People very soon wanted to see full length film, meaning it's kind of story film, a kind of narrative film. And there appeared in Bombay a person called Dada Saheb Dhundraj Gobind Phalke, in simple terms D.G. Phalke, a Brahmin gentleman who first filmed the first feature film called Raja Harishchandra in India. It was released in Bombay Coronation Theatre, but it has a long story. Dada Saheb was moved by cinema, a cinema called Life of Christ, a silent film. He was so overwhelmed that he decided to go to England in order to take a lesson on cinema. He went there, bought a camera, came back to Bombay, and then involving his own family, unthinkable in that time, he involved his wife Kaki Phalke, his daughter Mandakini, and everybody to film Raja Harishchandra. And there too we find a tragic story. The person who made India's first film, and also films like Kaliyamardan, Lanka Dahan, etc., almost died like a pauper in 1944. Nobody thought that some kind of prestige and honor should be accorded to D.G. Phalke, though we have now the D.G. Phalke Award initiated by the Government of India. Now, Phalke died, but his legacy remained, and in Kolkata you would see that people like J.F. Madan, after Hiralal Sen, began to consolidate the gains of film industry, in the sense that they did not stop at making films. They also arranged for distribution, they also arranged for proper auditorium. That way, Jamshedji Framji Madan, although a Parsi gentleman, not a Bengali in that sense of the term, founded the cinema empire in Kolkata. He made certain films using Bankim Chandra's novel and some religious storylines. He is the person responsible for first Bangla feature film called Billo Mongol in 1917, and he gradually occupied the whole of Indian filmdom. In fact, he became the emperor. Bombay too never remained silent, and there was cinemas also in Tamil Nadu, the then Madras presidency. In Madras, we have records that film making began a practice right from 1907. The poor Indians, having no literacy, naturally opted for film, because films never demand any kind of cinemacy or literacy in that sense of the term. It goes straight to the heart, and people apparently understood them. But what were those films? Mainly mythological and religious. But if you go in between the lines, if you try to decode the meanings of the film, you would find solid political content in them. Say Raja Harishchandra, though it briefed about the sacrifice made by Raja Harishchandra and the blessings that God showered on him, actually it spoke of the Hindu revivalist movement initiated by Lokmanya Tilak. And the Britishers naturally took note of these things after a couple of years, and in 1918 they formed the first cinematograph committee, and then from 1921 a kind of censorship was initiated when someone made Bhakta Vidur, and by seeing that film everybody understood that the person in charge of acting Bhakta Vidur was actually trying to copy Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. In 1921, for ready reference we may say that the first non-cooperation movement by M.K. Gandhi was launched. So, naturally a kind of political censoring began, though it was not extended to the field of erotic coupling, and we see long stretches of kisses in films like Karma made by Himanshu Rai and Devika Rani, and there are other films also where female body exposure were made possible by the filmmakers. Censor did not intervene that much with Indian erotica, it came much later. But we should move forward. Along with Jamshedji Framji Madan and Dada Saheb Phalke, there were other people like Dhiren Ganguly, who in 1921 made a film called England Returned, Bilet Terror, in which he first ridiculed the class who were blind followers of British etiquettes and civilizational mode. It was perhaps the first comment made outside the religious domain in Indian cinema. Then we should make a quick flash forward to welcome the age which is called the age of sound cinema. Sound came to Indian cinema in 1931 through the release of Alam Ara made by Pardesi Irani. In the next year, Devaki Kumar Bosu, a talented filmmaker, made Chandidas, and it became immense success because Chandidas, like its predecessors, could inject some political blood in the film. Chandidas is a love story between a Brahmin Vaishnavite poet, Chandidas, who is very famous in Bengal, with a washerwoman of lowly origin, Rami. It is a love story, but basically looking at the dialogue track, we discover that it resembles and it borrows freely from Gandhiji's idea of accommodating the so-called depressed caste into the mainstream of Congress politics, and that is why, paying tribute to the national aspiration, the film could become so popular. In the same year, New Theatre Studio got its proper foundation, and like USA, where the studios ran the show like MGM or UK or Columbia Pictures. In India, we saw the emergence of several studios like New Theatre Studio in Kolkata, Prabhat Studio in Pune, Bombay Talkies in Mumbai, Gemini Studio in Madras. They were like factories which, following assembly line productions, produced film, and they took the charge. In fact, those days New Theatres were the leader of Indian cinema production by their creative ability to use literary talents in cinema. The New Theatres under the leadership of Sir B. N. Sarkar understood that the intelligentsia like to have stories and the common people like to listen to these stories. That is why he quite liberally hired important literatures into his domain. All these Bangla literatures, practically Premendra Mitra, Shailananda Mukhopadhyay and others, they joined the New Theatres fray and began to write scripts for the films, and all the important singers of that period joined New Theatres and offered their lives in the films, because there was no playback system till that time. So, Bangla film began to enjoy huge popularity in terms of dialogue and in terms of singing. We can say K. L. Saigal, Kundal Saigal, Kanon Devi, Pankaj Mallik, Krishna Chandra De, Nazrul Islam, all were brought into the domain of cinema because of their melodious voice, and the actors who could sing were given prominence even if their talents were not always proved. Say Manna De's uncle K.C. De, he was not a good actor, but he was always employed either as a beggar or as sannyasi or saints, etc., only to use his voice. The producers liked him. The same story with Nazrul Islam. He was allowed to direct Bhakta Dhruvo only because of his melodious voice. New Theatres founded a tradition when a story can be told using audio visual medium, and that is why in Bengal people always confuse between books and films. They call films boi. The tradition is indebted to the attempts made by New Theatres in the 1930s. In the same way, Bombay Talkies in Bombay undertook some practice to eradicate superstitions. Say in 1936 they made Achut Kanna to fight untouchability, and their films were important for glamours, whereas Prabhat film, almost in line with New Theatre Studio, began to make a kind of film which spoke more of Marathi culture rather than of glamour and pomps. Their Sant Tukaram can be compared to Bengal's Chandidas, because both spoke very highly of two Vaishnavite saints. If we cross the 1935 period, we see that because of the huge success of Devdas, a double version film, in the Bangla version, the director played the role of the protagonist Devdas, and in the Hindi version, because of his faulty pronunciations, Pramotesh Barua opted for Kundal Lal Saigal. Kundal Lal played the role of Devdas, and it became a huge success. Then came Vidyapati, an instant success with the Indian audience. She used a kind of Hindi which became a style statement in the subcontinent. By they called it Anuradha Tea. And after that you find 1944 Udayer Pathe, in the way of awakening, where the first notion about this cross cultural love, the daughter of a rich man would be falling in love with a poor person, became palpable and valid. Right from 1900 to 1944, we see a gradual development of Indian film culture. It began as fairground attractions, magic, and simple mechanical toy, a turn of the century mechanical toy, but ultimately it aspired to voice the nation's anger and feelings of protest and other things. If you look at Rabindranath Tagore, he also took active interest in the early years of Indian cinema, not only because his stories were filmed, particularly Man Bhanjan and Chorabali, because that Rabindranath had some advice for the early Indian film which were largely ignored. He said, because he saw films mainly in the silent era, that films are not stories. They can be compared with the wordless music of Beethoven or like dance movements, and if choreographed properly, film could generate senses. And here we may mention that during his visit in Europe, he was offered a kind of project by the German film studio UFA to make a film, and he was engaged in this writing of the script a child, but somehow because of political pressure the project was abandoned and Rabindranath came back to India and lost all interest in filmmaking, though second time he was offered to make another project by the Hollywood people. Flaherty himself requested it to make a film, he was not interested. In fact, film in Bengal came as a replacement of literature. Right from 1930s, we notice that all literary pieces began to be translated in audiovisual terms and became films, and people usually go to attend films to have a glimpse of Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, Sharat Chandra Chattopadhyay or other novelists. This kind of things did not happen in other parts of India, particularly Bombay. You see, Bombay talkies ruled the show, and they brought spectacular European notion of film, of bioscope in Indian cinema, whereas the southern cinema preferred a kind of non-Aryan spectacular in their cinemas, the Chandralekha and others. This is the way when only Indian cinema began its journey, and if we consider India's strong oral tradition, we would see that a typical attitude to insert dialogues and songs were very much available with Indian early cinemas. The moment India arrived in the modern era with the presence of Satyajit Ray, we feel the movement was reversed. It was Satyajit Ray who first criticized this kind of attitude, and he said that despite everything, Indian cinema culture lacks the essence of movement. We misunderstood movement, and here movement was associated with action and action with melodrama, and analogy with music failed because Indian music, in his opinion, was largely improvisational. But that is yet another story, another part of the game that we will be dealing with another section, but it may be said that Indian cinema developed almost indigenously, and it took heavily, it borrowed heavily from Hollywood, but despite these borrowings, if we look at the pictorial designs and the soundtrack, we would find that India, this became in 20th century a kind of urban folklore. There we had feudal folklores, and cinema replaced the feudal folklores by applying a look of urbanity. And I would say that cinema in itself, being a modern instrument of communication, it is the intervention of machine that changed the conception of art here also. When cinema arrived, it influenced every other art forms, the poetry, drama and literature. It copied drama in Bombay, it copied the Persian theatre, in Kolkata it copied Star Theatre and other traditions. That is why the ancients like to call cinema plays, but ultimately it is interesting to note that cinema affected them all. They became pro-cinematic, proving that 20th century constitutes a kind of scopic regime of modernity, and cinema is the prime signature of this period.